In the past, the mentally ill were herded behind bars, chained and beaten. Insanity was looked upon as a disgraceful, mysterious disease with no hope of cure. Today, the picture is changing. Iron bars are giving way to modern safety windows and to new ideas on the cause and treatment of mental illness.
In the annals of medical history, there lurks one of the most infamous and tragic procedures ever conceived. A procedure that, in an attempt to cure the human mind, would leave many people as empty husks of their former selves. Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. This is the story of the lobotomy. The 21st century has witnessed significant breakthroughs in human brain research, but the path to modern neuroscience has been rather dark, marked by brutal medical experiments and accidents. In 1848, a young foreman named Phineas Gage was at work preparing a railroad bed. The terrain was rocky and uneven, requiring multiple holes to be drilled into the rock and filled with black powder. These black powder charges were meant to be covered with clay. Phineas used a tamping iron, a 13-pound metal rod, to press each explosive charge tightly into the hole. These charges would then be detonated from a safe distance. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned that day. Whilst he was distracted, Gage's tamping iron must have caught on a piece of rock as he was compressing the explosive charge. This caused a spark which ignited the black powder. The ensuing explosion turned the tamping iron into a projectile. It shot upwards and struck him in the face just below the cheekbone. It went straight up through his head and exited the top of his skull. The tamping iron itself landed 80 feet away, covered in blood and brain matter. When his co-workers saw what had happened, they were sure that Phineas was dead. They rushed to check on him, and to their astonishment they discovered that he was still alive and conscious. A doctor who later arrived on the scene said, "I first noticed the wound upon the head before I alighted from my carriage, the pulsations of the brain being very distinct. The top of his head appeared somewhat like an inverted funnel, as if some wedge-shaped body had passed from below upward. Mr. Gage got up and vomited. The effort of vomiting pressed out about half a teacupful of brain, which fell upon the floor." Phineas had survived the injury, or rather, some of him had survived. When, about 10 weeks later, his wounds were healed, he got ready to return to work. At this point it became clear that something wasn't quite right. This man, who had once been well liked and had many friends, became fitful, irreverent and grossly profane, showing little deference for his fellows. He quickly lost his job and his friends. Those who knew Phineas before the accident claimed that he was no longer Gage. Naturally, these events gained a lot of attention and it sparked a debate. How was Gage able to survive? Why did his personality change? For the time being, science had no answer. In 1874, an article was published in the American Journal of Medical Sciences. In this article, a man named Robert Bartholow describes the case of a young woman named Mary Rafferty. She had been brought to him whilst he was working in the hospital. Mary was unique. As an infant, she'd fallen into a fire which had severely burned her scalp. Her hair had never grown back, so she was forced to wear wigs throughout her life. Unfortunately, the friction from a whalebone in her wig caused an ulcer to appear on her head. A year later, part of her skull had been eroded and there was a hole around 2 inches in diameter. Through this infected wound, the pulsations of the brain were plainly seen. Mary had been brought to him because her brain seemed to be infected. The exposed part was covered in a greenish ooze, although Bartholow noted that this infection didn't seem to affect Mary's behaviour. At this time, scientists were conducting experiments on dogs' brains, injecting corrosive substances into their brains to determine which parts controlled specific functions. No doctor had ever had the chance to experiment on a living human brain before. Instead of trying to help the young woman, Bartholow decided to conduct a series of experiments on her. He inserted electrodes into her brain through the infected hole in her skull and ran an electrical current through them. In his article, Bartholow wrote, "When communication was made with the needles, her countenance exhibited a great distress, and she began to cry. Very soon the left hand was extended as if in an act of taking hold of some object in front of her. The arm presently was agitated with clonic spasms. Her eyes became fixed, with pupils widely dilated. Lips were blue, and she frothed at the mouth. Her breathing became stertorous. She lost consciousness and was violently convulsed on the left side. The convulsions lasted 5 minutes and was succeeded by coma." He wanted to continue these experiments, but Mary passed away as the infection spread and covered her entire brain in a thick layer of greenish-yellow pus. Naturally, the publication of this article caused a widespread outcry, and this effectively stopped any research of that nature in America for the time being. That was until Walter Freeman came along. Walter Freeman was an American neurologist with a mission. He came from a long line of successful medical professionals and was determined to leave his own mark on the history of medicine. As a neurologist, he'd spent a lot of time working with patients suffering from psychiatric problems, and he was painfully aware that medicine had very little to offer them other than a straitjacket in a mental institution. In 1935, Freeman attended a conference in London, and he was shown a case involving 2 chimpanzees, Becky and Lucy. These chimpanzees had been fairly aggressive and quite difficult to work with. The scientists theorized that cutting open skulls and removing the frontal lobes would make both these chimps more docile. The theory turned out to be correct. After parts of their brains were surgically removed, Becky and Lucy became more relaxed, calmer, and they were no longer aggressive. The surgery did seem to damage some of their mental abilities. After the procedure, the chimps seemed to be making more mistakes during cognitive tests, but nevertheless the operation seemed very promising enough to try on human brains. The procedure was called a lobotomy, and it had a success rate of about 35%. There was also a significant risk of the individual becoming epileptic, disabled, or even dying as a result of the procedure. Whilst these numbers seem pretty shocking today, back then there was no real alternative. Lobotomy offered at least a glimmer of hope for those who were previously considered beyond help. With these ideas in mind, Walter Freeman returned to the USA. He changed the name of the procedure to lobotomy, and in 1936, with his partner, neurosurgeon James Watts, they performed the first lobotomy on a patient in the United States. Their first patient was Alice Hammett, a housewife from Topeka who was plagued by anxiety, insomnia, and crushing depression for most of her life. She was also prone to nervous breakdowns and was plagued by extremely dark thoughts. Since Freeman wasn't actually a surgeon, Watts had to do most of the work. He was tasked with drilling holes into both sides of the person's head or on top of the skull. He was also responsible for cutting the neural connections between the prefrontal cortex and other parts of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for complex cognitive behavior, personality expression, decision-making, and moderating social behavior. Essentially, everything that makes you who you are as a person. It's also responsible for long-term planning, so if a person loses access to that part of their brain, all of their goals and dreams vanish. And so Alice had the operation, a hole was drilled and the prefrontal cortex was severed. After the operation, it seemed like Alice was completely cured. When she'd recovered from the surgery, she no longer seemed depressed, her anxiety seemed to be all gone, and overall she seemed to be much more calm. The press praised Freeman, and the first lobotomy in the USA was considered to be a great success. This was despite the fact that soon after the lobotomy, Alice had begun stuttering, and at times she seemed to suddenly become disorientated. Some months after the surgery, Alice suffered from a violent convulsion. This was likely a side effect of the lobotomy. The convulsions were so violent that she broke her wrist. Most disturbing, however, was that there was a change in her demeanour. Reportedly, for some time after that incident, she'd become more indolent and sometimes abusive. Alice died from pneumonia in 1941. This was 5 years after her lobotomy, which meant that it was impossible to observe any long-term side effects from her surgery. In the meantime, Freeman and Watts received more glowing praise from the press. The lobotomy was called a soul-healing procedure. With this endorsement from the press, Freeman and Watts began to carry out more and more lobotomies. By the early 1940s, the procedure had gained worldwide popularity. This rise in popularity did bring with it more scrutiny. People began to notice that after a lobotomy, the patient would appear to be altered, and not in a good way. They appeared to lack any sense of spontaneity, no desire to do anything unless they were prompted by another person. They often displayed a complete lack of initiative in starting conversations or taking any kind of physical action. Although in many cases their mental health problems were gone, they were left empty and lifeless, mere shadows of who they had once been. Eventually even Freeman had to acknowledge these side effects, but remarkably he was able to spin it. He turned it into a marketing opportunity. He said that lobotomized patients made nice household pets. Freeman's career flourished. By 1941 he was advertising the procedure as being nothing more complicated than a tooth extraction, and he said that it was perfectly safe. His most famous patient was Rosemary Kennedy. She had been secretly admitted for a lobotomy by her father. This had been kept secret even from her other family members. Since her youth, she displayed signs of a slight cognitive disability, and as she got older, Rosemary also experienced seizures and violent outbursts. She was a difficult child who didn't fit in well with the extremely ambitious Kennedy family. Freeman and Watts drilled a hole into the top of her skull under local anaesthesia. Freeman preferred local anaesthesia because he could hold a conversation with the patients whilst he observed changes in their behaviour whilst Watts sliced into their brains. During her lobotomy, Rosemary was asked to sing God Bless America whilst the connections between her frontal lobe and the thalamus were being cut. Tragically, it appears that Freeman, who was supposed to stop Watts at the right moment, hesitated for too long. There was one final cut, and Rosemary suddenly fell silent. At that moment, her personality, ambitions, and desires were gone forever. Immediately after the procedure, the Kennedys realised that something was very wrong with their daughter. Rosemary was completely paralysed and silent. It would take months of therapy before she could even move. With time, she gained partial use of one arm. She also had one leg permanently turned inwards, and she was unable to control her bodily functions. Horrified with what had happened to their daughter, Rosemary's family locked her away in a mental institution thousands of miles away from home. After many months in the institution and many therapy sessions later, Rosemary began to speak again, sort of. Until the end of her life, she could only speak through a mix of garbled sounds and random words. For 20 years, nobody from Rosemary's family even visited her. It was only after her father, Joe Kennedy, died from a stroke that Rosemary's mother decided to go and see her. Despite Rosemary's emotional bluntness, she reacted with a panicked rage when she saw her mother. Rosemary's lobotomy had reduced her mental capabilities to the level of a 2-year-old child. She required constant care for the rest of her life. When asked about this incident, her mother reportedly said, "Rosemary's mind is gone completely, and this was due to an accident which I don't really discuss." Freeman advertised the lobotomy as a precise and simple solution. He said it could fix headaches, mood swings, insomnia, and even digestive problems. Despite what he said, it was in fact extremely risky and imprecise. Neither Watts nor Freeman could have any certainty about the exact kind of damage they were causing in the patient's brain. Although, as far as their mental conditions were concerned, most patients did show some sign of improvement immediately after the surgery, many of them relapsed within a few months. This meant that some of Freeman's patients were lobotomized 2 or 3 times. In his book titled Psychosurgery, Freeman discusses cases of lobotomies that he deemed to be his most successful, which also makes you wonder how bad the cases are that he didn't include in the book. One case in the book involves a woman who had struggled with depression for 4 years. Freeman lobotomized her on September the 18th, 1937. He wrote, "For several days afterwards, the patient was slightly confused and was somewhat more aggressive and less self-pitying than she had been prior to the operation. A second lobotomy was performed on her 10 days later. After this, the woman could only lie quietly in bed with her eyes closed. She was neither sleeping nor awake, responding only when spoken to." Freeman described her as not appearing happy, but no longer moaning and whining as she had previously. Over time, her condition improved and she no longer complained of depression, but her loved ones noticed changes in her behaviour. She made plans, but she was unable to follow through. Whenever she planned to do chores like cooking or washing, she was unable to carry them out and she just sat in her chair. She would think about going to town but stay home instead. She dressed sloppily and often spilled food on herself. Whilst cooking, she often forgot to add simple ingredients. In June 1938, she suffered a generalized convulsive attack and continued to experience these convulsions every 1 or 2 months. The more lobotomies that he conducted, the more obvious it became that even after successful operations, patients were left drastically changed. When they weren't being prompted to do something, people who had had a lobotomy tended to just sit motionless with their eyes closed as if they were sleeping, but it wasn't true sleep. When spoken to loudly enough, they would open their eyes and respond without the typical signs that they were waking from a slumber. They would give no expression of interest, and after answering, the patient would just close their eyes again, appearing once more to be in this strange half sleep. A lot of them seemed to take no action of their own. They had to be told what to do at all times. If they were given a utensil, they would just hold it in their hand until somebody told them what to do with it. For example, if they were sat at a table and told to eat, they would immediately scoop up a spoonful of food and hold it in the air in front of them. And they would then either put it down or, when commanded, put it into their mouths. It was as if they were robots waiting for the next instruction. Some family members, tormented by the guilt, would later claim that they'd been misled by Freeman. But still, demand grew for the procedure to be carried out. With this increasing demand, Freeman became frustrated with how long it took to carry out the lobotomies. Plus, many mental institutions lacked operating theatres, so patients had to be transported to a separate facility. Then, in 1945, he had a flash of inspiration when he saw an ice pick in his kitchen. With this device in hand, he invented the transorbital lobotomy. His new method was pretty simple. Patients would be subjected to electroshocks until they were unconscious. Then an ice pick would be inserted through the upper eyelid into the eye socket and hammered through the thin layer of bone at the back of the socket up into the frontal lobe. The pick would then be swished back and forth inside the brain, severing the connections, and then it would be repeated on the other side. The procedure took about 10 to 15 minutes, and patients were reportedly sent home in taxis shortly after it was done. Freeman conducted his first ice pick lobotomy in 1946, and he deemed it to be a massive success. Soon afterwards, he purchased a van which he called the Lobotomobile, and he travelled around the USA performing lobotomies all over the country. This greatly increased the rate at which he performed lobotomies. Sometimes he would do up to 100 in a week. This continued for about 9 years. However, in 1952, the development of effective antipsychotic medications meant that the lobotomy looked like it would be made obsolete. Despite this advancement in medicine, Freeman remained skeptical, and he continued to advocate for lobotomies. I mean, of course he would. It was his primary source of income. He frequently argued that these newly developed antipsychotic medications could have unknown and serious side effects and were not safe for use, unlike the safe and effective ice pick to the brain, obviously. Even after Watts had parted way with him, Freeman persisted in performing these operations despite the fact that he wasn't a licensed surgeon. Over time, he started to introduce elements of showmanship to his procedures, performing the ice pick lobotomy in theatres with viewing galleries for interested onlookers. He did stunts like performing lobotomies on multiple people at the same time, or operating on 25 women in a single day. Even when a patient died from a brain hemorrhage caused by the lobotomy, he didn't stop and he just continued operating on the other patients. He also started to lobotomize children. The youngest patient to survive the ice pick lobotomy was a 12-year-old boy named Howard Dully. He had been admitted by his stepmother. This woman hated Howard. According to her own testimony, Howard often daydreamed, he disliked washing, and sometimes he turned on the lights when it was still bright outside. His stepmother believed that having him lobotomized would make him behave better. For quite some time she tried to have him diagnosed with a mental illness, but all the doctors that she took him to just shook their heads. To them, Howard was simply a healthy 12-year-old boy who liked to get up to mischief. Then she took him to Dr. Freeman. Based on the information that she gave him, Freeman diagnosed the boy with schizophrenia, and he recommended a lobotomy. At 1:30 p.m. on the 16th of September 1960, Howard Dully was wheeled into the operating theatre, strapped to a bed, and given a series of electric shocks to render him unconscious. That much he remembers. The rest, he says, is murky. Miraculously, Howard survived the operation with his personality intact and full control of his body. This wasn't the outcome that his stepmother wanted. She wanted him docile, easy to control. In fact, his behaviour continued to get worse. He was eventually sent to a school for children with behaviour problems. Later in life, he spent time in jail, and eventually he became homeless and addicted to alcohol. In his 50s, he managed to turn his life around, and he decided to do some research into the procedure that he'd had done on him as a child. He managed to gain access to his medical records and found out that his stepmother had paid Freeman $200 to carry out the lobotomy. In 2007, Howard Dully published his memoir titled My Lobotomy. In interviews, he would later say, "If you saw me, you'd never know that I'd had a lobotomy. The only thing you'd notice is that I'm very tall and weigh about 350 pounds, but I've always felt different, wondered if something's missing from my soul. I have no memory of the operation, and I never had the courage to ask my family about it. I'll never know what I lost in those 10 minutes with Dr. Freeman and his ice pick. By some miracle, it didn't turn me into a zombie, crush my spirits, or kill me, but it did affect me deeply. Walter Freeman's operation was supposed to relieve suffering, but in my case it did just the opposite. Ever since my lobotomy, I felt like a freak, ashamed. Freeman's career ended in 1967 when he accidentally killed yet another patient, a housewife, during her third lobotomy. After this incident, Freeman was banned from operating. Throughout his career, he performed over 3,500 lobotomies, and he caused the death of 490 people and left an unknown number of others permanently disabled. He spent his remaining days visiting former patients and trying to prove the positive effects of lobotomy. Thankfully, he didn't manage to change public opinion, and today lobotomy is no longer practiced, consigned to the history books as a barbaric and misguided treatment for mental illness. So that's the tale of Walter Freeman and the prefrontal lobotomy. If you found this video interesting, I do have another video about a brain surgery that went very wrong. The tale of Henry Molaison, the man who couldn't remember. I'll put a link at the end of the video and in the description if you want to check that out. So thank you for watching, and thank you as always to the patrons for the support. It's much appreciated and it really does help me keep making content, so thank you. Until next time, goodbye.